Welcome to where time falls quiet.
The hidden truth in ancient texts, discovering the people who came before us. What if the story we tell ourselves about civilization is backwards? What if the moment we call the beginning was actually the moment everything restarted? Imagine standing in the ruins of Uruk, the oldest known city, watching the sun rise over broken walls that once enclosed the first human experiment in organized life. The official narrative tells us this is where it all began, around 3,200 years before the Common Era. Scribes invented writing here, priests invented bureaucracy, humanity invented itself. But if you listen closely to what those same scribes actually wrote, you hear something else entirely. You hear them whispering about the people who came before. The archaeological record presents civilization as an explosion, not an evolution. Around 3000 BCE, advanced societies appear simultaneously across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, each already possessing sophisticated mathematics, complex writing systems, and monumental architecture. There is no apprenticeship period, no gradual progression from simple to complex. The Sumerian language appears fully formed with no linguistic ancestors, a linguistic isolate that contains technical vocabulary for astronomical observations, legal concepts, and architectural precision. Egyptian hieroglyphs emerge complete with grammatical structures that would remain essentially unchanged for 3,000 years. These cultures did not stumble toward literacy. They arrived already literate, as if remembering rather than inventing. Consider the consistency of their claims. Every major ancient culture describes its wisdom as inherited, not originated. The Egyptians attributed their knowledge to the followers of Horus, divine beings who ruled before the dynasties of men. The Sumerians recorded their laws and sciences as gifts from the Anunnaki, those who came from the heavens to earth. The Vedic texts of India speak of the 7 rishis who preserved knowledge through cycles of destruction. Chinese tradition describes the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors who brought civilization after the Great Flood. These are not creation myths, they are restoration myths. The language is explicit and repeated across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. We are not the first. We are the inheritors. The discomfort this creates in modern scholarship is profound. Academic consensus requires that civilization be an invention, a product of human ingenuity arising naturally from agricultural surplus and social complexity. To suggest otherwise seems to invite pseudoscience and ancient astronaut theories. But the texts themselves resist this comfortable narrative. When the Sumerian King List declares that before the flood, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years, and after the flood, kingship descended again from heaven, it is not speaking metaphorically. The document is clinical, bureaucratic, written in the same accounting style used for grain inventories and temple records. It treats pre-flood rulers with the same documentary precision as historical kings, whose reigns we can verify archaeologically. The scribes who compiled this list were not storytellers, they were archivists. Examine the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest surviving accounts of the Great Flood. The text is fragmentary, broken by time, but what survives is striking. It describes a time before cities when humanity lived scattered and primitive. Then the gods decided to create civilization. They built 5 cities, assigned divine governors, and taught humans agriculture, metalworking, and governance. For tens of thousands of years, this arrangement persisted. Then came the decision to destroy humanity through flood, opposed by the god Enki, who warned the righteous king Ziusudra to build a vessel and preserve life. After the waters receded, the gods granted Ziusudra eternal life, and kingship was lowered again from heaven. The pattern is unambiguous: civilization, destruction, restoration. Not origin, but resumption. This pattern reappears with unsettling consistency. Plato's account of Atlantis, derived from Egyptian priests, describes an advanced maritime civilization destroyed 9,600 years before Solon's visit to Egypt, approximately 9400 BCE. The priests explicitly tell Solon that the Greeks have forgotten their own true history, that multiple catastrophes have erased cultural memory. You have no ancient knowledge, they say, because floods and fires repeatedly destroy those who possess it, leaving only the illiterate mountain shepherds to restart. The Egyptians preserved this knowledge, they claim, because the Nile's flooding protected rather than destroyed their records. The implication is devastating. Written history is not a record of human origins, but a record of human recovery. The Hindu Puranas encode this cycle explicitly through the concept of yugas, vast ages of rise and decline. The texts describe previous manvantaras, cosmic cycles in which advanced civilizations flourished and fell. The Mahabharata speaks of vimanas, flying machines, and describes weapons whose effects sound disturbingly like nuclear explosions. Modern interpreters often dismiss these as fantasy, but the texts themselves present this technology as ancient history, knowledge possessed by those who came before the current age. The precision of the astronomical calculations embedded in these texts, the mathematical sophistication of their calendars, suggests authors who understood they were preserving information across a gap in time. Native American traditions across both continents speak of previous worlds that ended in catastrophe. The Hopi describe 4 previous worlds, each destroyed when humanity fell into corruption. The Maya Popol Vuh recounts multiple creations, each imperfect, each ending in destruction by flood, fire, or divine retribution. The Aztec creation myth describes 4 previous suns, 4 previous ages of humanity, all ending in apocalypse. These are not isolated myths. They are a global pattern of remembering. Cultures with no possibility of contact describe the same sequence: advanced civilization, moral decline, cosmic catastrophe, desperate preservation of knowledge, and restart. The archaeological evidence supports cyclical catastrophe. Multiple flood layers exist in the stratigraphic record of ancient Mesopotamia, particularly a massive deposit dated to approximately 2900 BCE that coincides precisely with the Sumerian accounts of the Great Deluge. Woolley's excavations at revealed this flood layer, 8 feet of clean silt devoid of artifacts, separating distinct cultural periods. Below the flood layer, sophisticated pottery, advanced tools, evidence of organized society. Above it, a restart, cultural continuity, but also disruption, as if survivors rebuilt from memory rather than continuing uninterrupted development. The flood was not metaphor. It was stratigraphy. What creates profound unease is not that ancient cultures spoke of those who came before, it is that they spoke of them with such consistency, across such distances, with such specificity. They describe not vague golden ages but concrete details, the measurements of pre-flood cities, the names of antediluvian kings, the specific technologies possessed and lost. They write as though compiling archives, preserving data across a gap they knew would erase context. If these accounts are merely myth, why do they read like desperate attempts at preservation? Why does every culture describe the same catastrophe, the same loss, the same inheritance? The whisper before history is becoming a voice. It speaks through the mathematics that appear too advanced for their supposed inventors. It speaks through the monuments aligned to astronomical cycles their builders allegedly never calculated. It speaks through the languages that contain vocabularies for concepts their speakers supposedly never encountered. It speaks through the flood layers, the genetic bottlenecks, the abrupt climate shifts that coincide exactly with the dates preserved in ancient texts. Most disturbingly, it speaks through the consistency of the warning. This has happened before. Knowledge can be lost completely. Civilization can forget it was ever civilized. And when the memory fades, the cycle begins again. If the first civilizations we know were not the first civilizations that existed, every assumption about human history shifts. The question is no longer, how did primitive humans invent writing, mathematics, and monumental architecture simultaneously across the globe? The question becomes, what are they trying to tell us they remembered? And why did they work so desperately to ensure we would eventually remember it too? Imagine holding a clay prism no larger than a wine bottle, its surface covered in cuneiform script, pressed into wet clay 4,000 years ago. The object is catalogue number WB444, housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. Scholars call it the Sumerian King List. To the scribes who compiled it, this was not mythology. This was the official dynastic record of kingship in Mesopotamia, preserved with the same bureaucratic precision used to track temple offerings and trade receipts. The document begins with a statement that should be impossible. Before the flood, kingship was lowered from heaven, and the reigns it records are not measured in years. They are measured in epochs. The list opens in the city of Eridu, the first city, where Alulim ruled as king for 28,800 years. His successor Al-Aljar governed for 36,000 years. In the city of Bad Tibira, 3 kings ruled for a combined 108,000 years. In Larak, 1 king ruled for 28,800 years. In Sippar, 1 king for 21,000 years. In Shuruppak, 1 king for 18,600 years. 8 kings total. 241,200 years of combined rule. Then comes the line that changes everything. The flood swept over the earth. After the flood, kingship was lowered again from heaven, and the reigns that follow are suddenly shorter, more human, eventually matching the archaeological record with precision. The conventional scholarly response is dismissal. These numbers are clearly mythological, inflated for religious or political purposes, symbolic rather than historical. But this interpretation requires ignoring how the document actually functions. The King List does not present these reigns as legends. It presents them in an unbroken chronological sequence that transitions seamlessly into verified historical rulers. The same scribal tradition that recorded the 43,200-year reign of Enmenlu-Ana also recorded the 24-year reign of Hammurabi. The same archival methodology, the same documentary style. The shift in reign length is acknowledged explicitly by the text itself through the flood marker, but the legitimacy of the pre-flood rulers is never questioned. They are treated as historical predecessors whose authority validates the post-flood dynasties. Hold that thought for a moment. Consider what these numbers actually represent. The figure 43,200 appears multiple times in the list. So does 28,800. These are not random inflations. They are specific multiples. 43,200 is exactly 12 times 3,600. 28,800 is exactly 8 times 3,600. The base unit, 3,600, appears throughout Mesopotamian mathematics and astronomy. It is the Sumerian Shah, a fundamental time unit in their sexagesimal counting system. More significantly, 3,600 is 100 times 36, and 36 is the number of complete precessional degree shifts the stars make over 25,920 years, the full precession of the equinoxes. The mathematics becomes more disturbing when you examine the total. 241,200 years of pre-flood kingship. Divide that by 6, and you get 42,200 years. This is not numerology. This is astronomical calculation. The pre-flood section is recording something related to celestial cycles, something their civilization inherited and preserved in the only format that would survive: bureaucratic record-keeping. The scribes were not inventing these numbers. They were copying them from older sources, preserving data they may not have fully understood, but recognized as critically important. The reigns are not measuring individual lifetimes. They are measuring epochs, ages, periods of celestial observation. This interpretation is reinforced by parallel texts. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in the 3rd century before the Common Era, preserved the same tradition in his History of Mesopotamia. He described 10 kings who ruled before the Great Flood, reigning for a combined 432,000 years. That number, 432,000, appears repeatedly in ancient astronomical texts. It is exactly 120 times 3,600. It equals 12,000 times 36. More significantly, it is extremely close to the actual length of the complete precessional cycle multiplied by specific orbital periods. Berossus was preserving the same data as the Sumerian King List, just in a different format. Both are encoding astronomical observations in the form of kingly reigns. The Greek tradition preserves the pattern. Egyptian records told Herodotus that before the human dynasties, gods ruled Egypt for thousands of years, followed by demigods before mortal kings took the throne. The Turin King List, a papyrus from the 13th century before the Common Era, records the same sequence: the rule of the gods, the rule of the followers of Horus, then human pharaohs. The Palermo stone, one of the oldest Egyptian historical records, begins its chronology before the unification of Egypt with shadowy pre-dynastic rulers whose reign lengths are damaged but clearly span vast periods. The Egyptian priest Manetho, writing his History of Egypt in the 3rd century before the Common Era, stated explicitly that divine beings ruled Egypt for 13,900 years before the first human dynasty. The Hindu tradition is even more explicit. The Puranas describe Manvantaras, cosmic ages lasting millions of years, within which rise and fall multiple civilizations. The Mahabharata references previous yugas where kings possessed extraordinary lifespans and advanced technology. The Jain tradition speaks of 63 great souls who guide humanity through vast time cycles. The Buddhist cosmology describes world systems that exist for incomprehensible durations before dissolution and reconstitution. While the specific numbers vary between traditions, the pattern is identical. Before our current age of short-lived rulers and limited humanity, there existed ages where beings of greater knowledge and longer lifespans governed the world. What emerges is not mythology. It is a global archival system. Ancient civilizations across continents with no possibility of contact independently preserve the same data structure. Legitimate rulership derives from those who came before the catastrophe. The authority to govern in the present age is validated by descent from, or appointment by, the survivors of the previous age. This is why the Sumerian King List matters so intensely to its creators. It is not a religious text. It is a legal document establishing governmental legitimacy through unbroken lineage to pre-flood authority. Without that connection, post-flood kingship has no cosmic sanction. The document exists to prove continuity across the break. The break itself is marked with precision. Every version of the King List in every city where copies were found includes the same statement at the same point. The flood swept over. Then kingship descends again, and reign lengths immediately become recognizably human. The first post-flood dynasty at Kish lists 23 kings with reigns ranging from 625 years to 1200 years, still inflated, but trending rapidly toward normal human lifespans. By the time we reach the third dynasty of Ur, around 2100 before the Common Era, the recorded reigns match archaeological evidence exactly. King Shulgi ruled for 48 years. His successor Amasin ruled for 9 years. These are verifiable through contemporary inscriptions and dated tablets. The King List transitions seamlessly from the impossible to the historical without changing format or style. This creates an impossible interpretive situation. If the entire pre-flood section is mythological invention, why does the post-flood section become increasingly accurate as it approaches the present? If the scribes were capable of fabricating 43,000-year reigns for religious purposes, why did they suddenly start recording accurate reign lengths? The document does not read like a transition from myth to history. It reads like a continuous historical record that spans a catastrophic discontinuity. The reigns before the flood are encoded differently because the timekeeping system itself was different, or because the information was transmitted across the gap in corrupted form, or because the scribes were preserving astronomical data in dynastic format. But the text itself never suggests these rulers were fictional. The scribes who compiled the Sumerian King List were not naive. They were professional archivists working within a sophisticated bureaucratic system. They had access to older tablets, temple records, and oral traditions. They knew they were preserving something that predated their own civilization. The phrase kingship was lowered from heaven appears at the beginning and again after the flood. Not established, not created, lowered, descended, transmitted. The language implies reception, not origination. Sumerian civilization understood itself as inheriting authority and knowledge from a previous dispensation. The King List exists to document that inheritance and prove its legitimacy. Every city that possessed a copy was asserting its connection to the unbroken chain of rulership extending back before the world was remade by water. If we read these documents as their creators intended, not as mythology but as archive, the implication is staggering. The first civilizations we know were not describing their own beginning. They were describing their resumption. They knew they came after. The kings they served understood themselves as stewards of recovered knowledge, rulers by right of inheritance from those who governed before the catastrophe. And they preserved this claim with such precision, in such detail, across such spans of time, because they needed future generations to know, this has happened before. Authority derives from survival, and the cycle will come again. Languages do not appear from nothing. They evolve gradually through centuries of contact, borrowing, and transformation. Proto-Indo-European gave birth to Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and eventually English through traceable phonetic shifts and grammatical simplifications. We can map the family tree of most major language groups, following them back through time to reconstructed parent tongues. But some languages stand alone, linguistic orphans with no known relatives, no evolutionary pathway, no simpler ancestors. Sumerian is one of these isolates, Basque is another. Egyptian, though later connected to the Afro-Asiatic family, appears in written form already mature, with no primitive stage. These languages arrive in history complete, as if remembering rather than forming. Sumerian presents the most disturbing case. When it appears in the archaeological record around 3200 before the Common Era, it is already a sophisticated agglutinative language with complex grammar, extensive vocabulary, and specialized technical terminology. There are no simpler Proto-Sumerian inscriptions, no evidence of a learning curve. The earliest tablets from Uruk show a writing system already capable of expressing abstract legal concepts, mathematical operations, and astronomical observations. Linguists have searched for a parent language or related tongue for over a century. They have found nothing. Sumerian connects to no other known language family. It exists in isolation, a linguistic island suggesting either an origin so ancient that all related languages vanished, or transmission from a source we cannot trace. The vocabulary itself contains disturbing anomalies. Sumerian possesses technical terms for concepts that, according to the standard chronology, should not exist in their cultural context. They have words for specific types of celestial events, for particular orbital mechanics, for architectural techniques that leave no archaeological trace in their own civilization. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Akkadian but drawing on older Sumerian sources, describes the hero's journey to witness a great flood survivor. The survivor, Utnapishtim, recounts details of antediluvian civilization with specificity that reads like testimony rather than invention. He describes cities, technologies, and social structures that predate the flood. The language treats these things as historical memory, not mythological creation. Egyptian hieroglyphics present a parallel mystery. The system appears fully developed around 3100 before the Common Era, with complete grammatical structures, phonetic complements, and ideographic sophistication. There is no period of experimentation, no primitive stage where scribes work out how to represent language visually. The Nama palette, one of the earliest inscribed objects, already displays mastery of the system. Earlier pre-dynastic pottery shows simple symbols, but the leap to full hieroglyphic writing happens suddenly, as if the system was implemented rather than invented. The Greeks later claimed that Thoth, the god of wisdom, gave writing to Egypt. Egyptian tradition itself agreed. The scribes did not invent their script, they inherited it. More troubling is Egyptian vocabulary for celestial catastrophe. The language contains specific terms for particular types of cosmic threats. Words for celestial fire falling from the sky, for waters rising beyond natural flooding, for darkness that lasts days, for the sky itself transforming. The Edfu building texts, inscribed on temple walls but claiming to record pre-dynastic knowledge, describe a time when the gods fought celestial enemies and rebuilt the world after destruction. These texts use technical, architectural, and astronomical terminology to describe the reconstruction of sacred sites according to the pattern of the first time, a mythological epoch before the current age. The language does not describe these events poetically. It describes them with the precision of engineering documentation. The Chinese written language presents its own discontinuity. Oracle bone script appears in the Shang dynasty around 1300 before the Common Era, already complex and standardized. While scholars have traced its evolution through subsequent dynasties, its origin point remains mysterious. The characters themselves encode ancient cosmological knowledge. Many combine symbols representing heaven, earth, and humanity in configurations that suggest sophisticated astronomical understanding. Chinese tradition attributes writing to Kangji, a legendary figure with 4 eyes who observed the patterns of and stars to create characters. The tradition does not claim invention, it claims observation and recording of pre-existing patterns. Across the Pacific, The Mayan writing system emerges around 200 before the Common Era in its developed form, though earlier symbolic systems existed. What disturbs scholars is not the writing itself, but what it records. Mayan inscriptions demonstrate mathematical and astronomical precision that rivals modern calculations. They possessed a positional number system including 0, something Europe would not achieve until receiving it from India centuries later. Their calendar synchronized multiple cyclical counts with accuracy requiring generations of astronomical observation. Yet Mayan mythology insists this knowledge came from Itzamna, a culture hero who taught writing, astronomy, and agriculture after arriving from across the sea. The Popol Vuh explicitly states that the current creation is the fourth attempt, that previous humanities possessed knowledge later lost and partially recovered. The pattern extends beyond writing to the structure of language families themselves. The Proto-Indo-European reconstruction reveals a language of remarkable sophistication, with 8 grammatical cases, 3 numbers, and complex verbal aspects. This was not a primitive tongue. It was already the product of long development. But what came before it? Where are the simpler ancestral languages? The reconstruction points back to somewhere around 4000 before the Common Era in the Pontic-Caspian steppe. But there the trail ends. No earlier stage can be reconstructed. The language family simply begins there, fully formed and ready to diversify into the hundreds of daughter languages we can trace. Linguistic isolates multiply the mystery. Basque, spoken in the Pyrenees, connects to no other European language. Its structure and vocabulary suggest extreme antiquity. Genetic studies show Basque speakers descend from pre-Indo-European populations. The language survived when all its relatives vanished. Etruscan, spoken in ancient Italy before Roman expansion, was a linguistic isolate whose origins remain unknown despite numerous inscriptions. The Etruscans themselves claim to have migrated from Anatolia after a great catastrophe. Japanese shows possible distant connections to Korean and Altaic languages, but functions essentially as an isolate. Ainu, spoken in northern Japan, connects to nothing. Each of these orphan languages hints at vanished language families, entire populations whose linguistic heritage survived in only one descendant. The Nostratic hypothesis attempts to resolve this by proposing a superfamily connecting Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, Uralic, Altaic, Dravidian and Kartvelian languages to a common ancestor spoken perhaps 15,000 years ago. If true, this pushes language development back before the end of the last ice age, suggesting complex human societies existed during the glacial maximum. But even Nostratic, if accepted, only pushes the mystery deeper. What came before Nostratic? At some point, language itself had to emerge, but the languages we can actually study, the oldest ones preserved in writing or reconstructed from daughters, are never primitive. They are always complex, always sophisticated, always showing signs of long development before the point where we can observe them. Consider what this means. Language is humanity's most fundamental technology. It shapes thought, enables cooperation, transmits culture across generations. Complex language requires complex society to sustain it. Technical vocabulary requires technical practice to create it. The astronomical terminology in Sumerian was not invented by poets. It was created by observers who spent generations tracking celestial cycles. The architectural language in Egyptian texts was developed by builders who constructed according to precise mathematical principles. The mathematical language in Chinese characters was formulated by calculators who needed to record operations and results. These vocabularies are not creative fiction, they are documentation of practice. If languages appear in history already possessing technical vocabulary for advanced practices, one of two possibilities exists. Either those civilizations developed those practices so rapidly that we cannot detect the progression archaeologically, or they inherited the vocabulary from a previous cultural context. The first option requires believing that Sumerian civilization went from no writing to complex cuneiform, from no astronomy to precise celestial calculation, from no architecture to monumental construction, all within a few generations. The archaeological record does not support this. The second option requires accepting that Sumerian, Egyptian, and Chinese civilizations were recovering and adapting knowledge from an earlier cultural dispensation, preserving in language what had been lost in practice. The linguistic evidence does not prove pre-flood civilizations, but it demonstrates that the oldest languages we can study were never primitive. They arrive in history mature, complete, bearing vocabularies for practices we cannot fully trace to their cultural contexts. They function as archives, preserving terminology that outlasted the catastrophes that broke continuity. The words themselves are artifacts, more durable than stone, more accurate than memory. They whisper about what was known before writing existed to record it, about observations made before our historical records began, and they suggest that when civilization restarted after the flood, after the ice, after whatever discontinuity broke the chain, it did not start from nothing. It started from fragments, from inherited words for lost practices, from languages that remembered more than their speakers could explain. The tongue does not forget as quickly as the hand, and sometimes the words we speak contain echoes of knowledge we no longer possess. Stone remembers what flesh forgets, while human memory distorts and fades, while oral traditions transform through retelling, while written records burn and decay. Stone preserves the truth of what touched it. Water leaves its mark. Fire leaves its signature. Time itself is written in layers of sediment and erosion patterns that cannot lie. When we examine the physical evidence of catastrophe in the archaeological record, we find that the ancient texts were not exaggerating. The flood swept over, the world burned, the sky fell, and the stone remembers every moment. Begin with the most famous anomaly, the Great Sphinx of Giza. Orthodox Egyptology dates its construction to the reign of Khafra around 2500 before the Common Era, based primarily on its proximity to Khafra's pyramid and the stylistic similarity of the face to other 4th Dynasty sculptures. But in 1991, geologist Robert Schoch examined the Sphinx enclosure and reached a conclusion that shattered conventional chronology. The vertical weathering patterns on the Sphinx and the walls of its enclosure were caused by prolonged rainfall, not wind and sand. In the arid climate of Egypt's historical period, such erosion would be impossible. The last time the Giza Plateau experienced rainfall heavy enough to create these erosion patterns was during the African humid period, which ended around 3000 before the Common Era, with the heaviest precipitation occurring between 7,000 and 5,000 years before the Common Era. The implications are devastating for the standard timeline. If the Sphinx was carved when these rainfall patterns existed, it predates Egyptian dynastic civilization by thousands of years. Schoch's analysis was not based on interpretation or dating methods that could be disputed. It was based on the physical reality of water erosion visible to any geologist who examines the site. The weathering patterns are vertical and undulating, characteristic of rainfall. The surrounding plateau shows horizontal wind erosion, characteristic of desert conditions. The Sphinx enclosure shows a different weathering history, one that requires a different climate, one that requires a date extending far beyond the 4th dynasty. The stone does not negotiate. It shows what happened to it. Egyptologists responded by arguing that the weathering could result from groundwater seepage or Nile flooding. But the enclosure sits above the historical Nile floodplain, and groundwater seepage creates different erosion patterns, typically undermining foundations rather than creating the surface weathering visible on the Sphinx. Schoch's conclusion has been supported by other geologists who examined the site independently. The weathering is consistent with rainfall erosion during a climate period that ended before Egyptian dynastic history began. This creates two possibilities. Either the Sphinx is far older than conventional dating allows, or the climate of Egypt was fundamentally different during the 4th dynasty than the geological record indicates. The second option contradicts everything we know about North African climate history. The Sphinx anomaly is reinforced by the inventory stela, a damaged limestone tablet discovered in the 1850s near the Great Pyramid. The inscription, though dating to the 26th dynasty around 600 before the Common Era, claims to record ancient information. It states that Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid, ordered repairs to the Sphinx after it was damaged by lightning. The text explicitly states that the Sphinx already existed when Khufu began his reign, that it stood near the pyramid of Isis, mistress of the pyramid, and that both monuments were already ancient in Khufu's time. While Egyptologists dismiss this as a later fabrication designed to enhance the antiquity of the site, the stela's claim is consistent with the geological evidence. If the Sphinx predates the 4th dynasty, then later Egyptian rulers would have been restoring an already ancient monument, exactly as the inventory stela describes. Move now to Mesopotamia, where flood layers tell their own unambiguous story. During excavations at Ur in the 1920s and 1930s, archaeologist Leonard Woolley discovered a massive deposit of clean water-laid silt, separating distinct cultural periods. The flood layer was 8 feet deep in some areas, completely devoid of artifacts or organic material, a sterile break in the stratigraphic sequence. Below this layer, Woolley found evidence of the Ubaid culture, sophisticated pottery, developed architecture, clear signs of organized urban life. Above the layer, the culture continued but showed disruption, rebuilding, a sense of starting over with inherited knowledge rather than continuous development. The flood was not a mythological metaphor. It was a geological event that left physical evidence exactly where Sumerian texts said it occurred. This flood layer is not unique to Ur. Similar deposits have been found at other Mesopotamian sites, though they do not all date to the same period, suggesting multiple catastrophic flooding events in the region's history. At Shuruppak, the city associated with the flood, hero Ziusudra in Sumerian texts, excavations revealed a significant flood layer dating to approximately 2900 before the Common Era. At Kish, archaeologists found flood deposits dating to approximately 3100 before the Common Era. These dates cluster around the period when Sumerian civilization shows signs of disruption and reorganization, exactly the period when the Sumerian King List places the Great Deluge. The correspondence between textual accounts and physical evidence is too precise to dismiss as coincidence. The global of flood traditions gains credibility when we examine sea level rise at the end of the last ice age. Between 15,000 and 7,000 years before the Common Era, global sea levels rose approximately 400 feet as the glaciers melted. This was not a gradual process. Geological evidence shows periods of rapid, catastrophic flooding called meltwater pulses. Meltwater pulse 1A, occurring around 14,600 years ago, raised sea levels by approximately 50 feet in less than 500 years. Meltwater pulse 1B, around 11,400 years ago, caused another dramatic rise. Coastal populations would have experienced these events as apocalyptic flooding, the sea swallowing entire landscapes within living memory. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis provides a specific mechanism for regional flood traditions. Around 5700 before the Common Era, rising Mediterranean waters may have breached the Bosphorus Strait, flooding the Black Sea basin, which had been a freshwater lake with salt water in a catastrophic event. Geological cores from the Black Sea floor show a distinct transition from freshwater to saltwater conditions at this time. If populations lived around the shores of the Black Sea Lake, they would have witnessed their world drowned, forcing mass migration and preserving the trauma in cultural memory. This timing places the event within the range of early agricultural societies capable of preserving oral traditions that would eventually be recorded in Sumerian texts. But water was not the only catastrophe stone remembers. Layers of ash and burned material appear in stratigraphic sequences worldwide, markers of massive fires that consumed landscapes. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that around 12,800 years ago, a comet or asteroid airburst caused widespread fires, climate disruption, and the extinction of North American megafauna. While debated, the hypothesis is supported by the presence of nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, and other impact markers in sediment layers dating to this period. Native American traditions describe a time when the sky burned and the world was consumed by fire before being renewed. The geological record confirms massive burning events at the end of the Pleistocene. The Carolina Bays present another geological mystery that stone preserves. Hundreds of thousands of elliptical depressions oriented in the same direction scar the Atlantic coastal plain from New Jersey to Florida. Their origin remains debated, but many researchers suggest they resulted from a massive cosmic impact or airburst that scattered debris across a vast area. The bays show evidence of formation through high-energy events, and their orientation suggests an impact from the northwest. If such an event occurred within human presence in North America, it would have been witnessed as fire falling from the sky, exactly as numerous Native American traditions describe. Across the Mediterranean, evidence of Bronze Age collapse around 1200 before the Common Era shows widespread destruction by fire and earthquake. Cities from Anatolia to Greece to the Levant burned simultaneously or in rapid succession. The Sea Peoples, mysterious invaders whose origin remains unknown, appear in Egyptian records destroying everything in their path. But underlying the invasions is evidence of climate change, drought, and seismic activity. The Mediterranean is a tectonically active region. Multiple civilizations collapsed simultaneously because the Earth itself was in upheaval. Stone preserves the burn layers, the collapsed walls, the hastily buried treasures as populations fled. Volcanic eruptions add their signature to stone memory. The Thera eruption around 1600 before the Common Era devastated the Aegean, possibly contributing to the decline of Minoan civilization. Volcanic ash from this eruption appears in ice cores and sediment layers across the eastern Mediterranean. The explosion would have generated tsunamis, ashfall, climate disruption, and destruction visible across the ancient world. Plato's account of Atlantis mentions volcanic activity and catastrophic destruction. While the timing does not match precisely, the Thera eruption demonstrates that Mediterranean civilizations experienced apocalyptic volcanic events within their cultural memory. The stone does not lie. It cannot be persuaded by ideology or tradition. Water erosion on the Sphinx proves rainfall in a period conventionally considered arid. Flood layers at prove catastrophic inundation in the exact location ancient texts describe. Sea level rise proves global flooding at the end of the Ice Age. Burn layers prove massive fires. Impact markers prove cosmic catastrophe. The physical record confirms that ancient civilizations experienced the destruction they describe. The flood was not metaphor. The burning was not exaggeration. The stone remembers, and its memory validates the warnings preserved in text. This has happened before, it can happen again, and survival requires remembering. Mathematics does not forget. A theorem once proven remains true regardless of who knows it or when it was discovered. The Pythagorean theorem existed before Pythagoras, before Greece, before any human mind comprehended it. Mathematical truth is independent of human civilization, but mathematical knowledge is not. It must be discovered, proven, transmitted, preserved. When we find advanced mathematical understanding in ancient cultures that supposedly had no need for such sophistication, we face a disturbing question. Were they discovering these principles themselves, or remembering them from an earlier source? The tablets do not answer this question directly, but they whisper. Consider Tablet Plimpton 322, a small clay rectangle housed in Columbia University's collection. Dating to approximately 1800 before the Common Era, from the Old Babylonian period, this tablet contains a list of numbers arranged in columns. For decades after its discovery in the early 20th century, scholars debated its purpose. Then mathematicians recognized what they were seeing: a table of Pythagorean triples, sets of three integers that satisfy the equation describing right triangles. The tablet lists 15 such triples, not the simple obvious ones like 3, 4, 5, but complex examples like 4569, 3391, 3721. These are not accidental discoveries. They are the product of systematic calculation using sophisticated number theory. What makes Plimpton 322 disturbing is not just that Babylonians knew the Pythagorean theorem over 1,000 years before Pythagoras. It is that the tablet shows no working, no derivation, no explanation. It is a reference table, the kind of tool used by practitioners who already understand the underlying principles so completely that they need only the results. The scribe who created this tablet was not discovering mathematics. He was compiling it, copying from earlier sources, preserving knowledge that his civilization used routinely. The tablet assumes an audience that understands why these numbers matter, what calculations they enable, how to apply them in practice. It is addressed to experts, not students. The sophistication deepens with tablet YBC 7289, another old Babylonian clay document. This tablet shows a square with its diagonals marked, annotated with numbers. When translated, it reveals a calculation of the square root of 2, accurate to 6 decimal places. The value given is 1.414213, compared to the actual value of 1.414235. This level of precision requires not just understanding irrational numbers, which Greek mathematicians would later struggle to accept philosophically, but also possessing computational methods sophisticated enough to calculate them accurately. The tablet demonstrates that Babylonian mathematicians worked with irrational numbers as practical tools, not philosophical problems. But the truly unsettling discovery lies in tablets dealing with astronomical calculation. Babylonian astronomy achieved predictive accuracy that would not be matched again until the development of modern observational astronomy. They tracked planetary positions, predicted eclipses, calculated lunar cycles with precision, requiring continuous observation over centuries. Tablet number CBS 10673, from approximately 300 before the Common Era, contains calculations tracking Jupiter's position using geometric methods nearly identical to those developed in 14th century Europe. The tablet shows that Babylonian astronomers understood concepts of instantaneous velocity and used geometric techniques to calculate planetary motion that would later be considered revolutionary achievements of medieval European mathematics. The sexagesimal system itself, the base 60 counting system used by Sumerians and Babylonians, reveals mathematical sophistication that seems inexplicable for a supposedly early civilization. Base 60 is not intuitive. It does not arise naturally from counting on fingers, but it is mathematically elegant, divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making fraction calculations far simpler than in base 10. This system enabled Babylonian mathematicians to perform complex calculations that would be cumbersome in decimal notation. The sexagesimal system was not invented by primitive accountants tracking grain stores. It was designed by mathematicians who understood number theory deeply enough to recognize the computational advantages of this particular base. We still use base 60 for time and angular measurement: 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These are not arbitrary conventions. They are inherited directly from Sumerian mathematics, preserved through Babylonian astronomy, transmitted to Greek age, passed to Islamic scholars, and eventually adopted by European civilization. Every time we check a clock or measure an angle, we are using a mathematical system designed over 4,000 years ago by a culture that supposedly had just invented writing. The system has never been improved upon for its purpose. It remains optimal. The Egyptian mathematical papyri present similar anomalies. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, copied around 1650 before the Common Era, but claiming to derive from earlier sources, contains problems demonstrating knowledge of algebra, geometry, and number theory. Problem 79 involves calculating a geometric series. Problem 50 involves calculating the area of a circle using an approximation of pi accurate to within 1%. The papyrus approaches mathematics practically, presenting problems and solutions without theoretical justification, suggesting the scribe was preserving techniques whose origins he did not fully understand. The introduction states explicitly that the content represents ancient knowledge being copied to preserve it. The Moscow mathematical papyrus, dating to approximately 1850 before the Common Era, contains a problem calculating the volume of a truncated pyramid. The formula given is correct and requires understanding of three-dimensional geometry. But Egypt did not build truncated pyramids as major monuments. The calculation addresses a theoretical problem or describes a construction technique no longer in practice. Why would Egyptian scribes preserve this knowledge if they were not using it? The papyrus suggests they were maintaining a mathematical tradition inherited from earlier builders, whose full range of constructions we may not have discovered or recognized. Move now to India, where the Sulba Sutras, ancient texts accompanying Vedic ritual, contain sophisticated geometry. These texts, dating to approximately 800 before the Common Era, but claiming greater antiquity, provide precise instructions for constructing altars and fire platforms using advanced geometric principles. They contain accurate calculations of square roots, methods for constructing right angles, techniques for transforming one geometric shape into another of equal area. The Sulba Sutras know the Pythagorean theorem and state it explicitly, centuries before Greek mathematics. But these are not mathematical treatises. They are ritual manuals. The mathematics is presented as necessary knowledge for proper religious construction, suggesting that geometric precision was considered sacred knowledge inherited from the gods. The Celtic Druids, according to Julius Caesar, possessed extensive knowledge of astronomy, natural philosophy, and geometry, transmitted orally through decades of training. When Roman conquest destroyed Druidic culture, this knowledge vanished almost entirely, leaving only hints in archaeological alignments and later Welsh and Irish texts. Stone circles across Britain and Ireland demonstrate astronomical alignments requiring generations of observation and mathematical calculation to plan. Stonehenge aligns with solstices and lunar cycles, with precision requiring sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. Yet we have no written mathematical texts from these cultures, only the monuments themselves, testifying that knowledge existed which left no textual trace. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck but dating to approximately 100 before the Common Era, is a bronze device containing dozens of precision gears, designed to calculate astronomical positions and predict eclipses. Its sophistication rivals clocks built 1,500 years later. The device demonstrates that Hellenistic civilization possessed mechanical and mathematical knowledge far beyond what survives in their written texts. Only one example has been found. How many were built? How long had the technology existed? What earlier devices were its predecessors? The mechanism is an artifact of a technological tradition we barely glimpse through the single surviving example. What unites these mathematical ghosts is their completeness. They do not show civilizations learning mathematics. They show civilizations using mathematics they already know. Plimpton 322 is a reference table, not a teaching text. The Egyptian papyri are copying ancient knowledge. The Sulba Sutras present geometry as inherited sacred wisdom. The Babylonian astronomical tablets demonstrate centuries of accumulated observation. None of these sources show the learning curve we would expect if these civilizations were inventing mathematics from first principles. They show practitioners working within established traditions, preserving techniques, applying known methods. The alternative explanation is that ancient civilizations independently discovered advanced mathematics much faster than seems plausible given their technological context. A culture just developing writing somehow designs an optimal base 60 number system. A society using copper tools calculates the square root of 2 to 6 decimal places. Bronze Age astronomers developed geometric methods for planetary motion that medieval Europe will consider revolutionary. Each achievement is possible individually, but the concentration of sophisticated mathematics in the earliest periods of civilizations that claim to be recovering lost knowledge creates a pattern that reinforces their own assertions. We inherited this, we are preserving this, we remember this from before. The mathematics survives because numbers are culture independent. A Pythagorean triple remains true regardless of language or belief system. The calculation of pi works identically in Sumerian, Egyptian, or English. Mathematical knowledge can be transmitted across cultural breaks more easily than other knowledge because it does not depend on context. When civilization collapsed, when libraries burned, when populations scattered, the mathematics could be preserved by anyone who understood its use, even if they no longer knew its origin. And so we find these ghost formulas appearing complete in the oldest sources, demonstrating sophistication that their supposed inventors could not have needed or developed alone. The tablets whisper, "We were taught this, we remember this, we preserve this from those who calculated before us." Imagine for a moment that you are not a believer or a skeptic, but a clerk. Your job is not to worship, but to record. You sit in a dim room in ancient Ur, a reed stylus in your hand, wet clay before you, and a supervisor behind your shoulder counting slowly. You are transcribing an older tablet, one already cracked at the edges, its signs eroded by time and handling. The text does not sound like myth. It sounds like administration. Lists of names, titles, responsibilities, quantities of grain, lengths of rain, precise locations of temples and shrines. Yet the beings you are cataloguing are not kings in the ordinary sense. They are Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. We have been trained to hear that word through the filter of modern fantasy, to see shining spacecraft and alien engineers descending from the stars. But the ancient scribes were doing something very different. They were translating a memory into a bureaucracy. The Anunnaki are always described in numerical terms: groups of 50, councils of 7, assemblies with quorum. They have specific roles. Some govern heaven, some govern the earth, some supervise the great below. They are assigned cities, temples, domains of responsibility. The texts treat them the way a modern civil service file treats departments and directors, not the way a cult hymn treats distant, unknowable deities. This is not worship language. It is organizational chart language. In the earliest Sumerian compositions, these beings are not yet abstract sky gods. They are described as tangible presences who walk among humans, dine in their temples, sail in boats along the rivers, travel between cities and convene in council to make policy decisions. They establish laws, set measurements, define weights and standards. They teach agriculture, writing, metallurgy, and architecture. The stories that later become myth begin as something closer to minutes of meetings and legal record. Anu grants kingship. Enlil assigns territories. Enki instructs craftsmen. The human role is explicit and subordinate: to serve, to build, to maintain the installations of these higher beings. If you strip away the divine gloss, you are left with a disturbing possibility. The gods of the earliest texts are the remembered form of an earlier human or quasi-human elite, a group of other people who possessed greater knowledge, longer lifespans, and authority derived from survival through cataclysm. The later cultures, looking back across generations, no longer understood their biology or technology. They only knew hierarchy and power, so they called them gods. But the vocabulary of the texts betrays the original relationship. These were administrators, supervisors, engineers, not omnipotent creators, but specialists. Egypt presents a similar pattern. In the Palermo stone, the earliest fragmentary king list, before the names of human pharaohs appear, we find the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. Egyptian priestly tradition maintained that before the first mortal king unified the two lands, a line of divine rulers and their followers governed for thousands of years. They are not described as incorporeal spirits. They are portrayed as beings who physically ruled, built temples, and established cult centers. Their titles sound more like offices than mystical epithets. When later Egyptians speak of the time of Zep Tepi, the first time, they refer to a concrete period when these beings walked the earth and set the template for everything that followed. The Edfu building texts carved into the walls of a Ptolemaic temple, but claiming to record very ancient information, describe the divine companions who survived a great flood and came to Egypt to rebuild. They are said to have arrived at a primeval island, to have surveyed the land, and to have reconstructed temples according to plans preserved from the destroyed world. The language used is astonishingly technical. Measurements, layouts, alignments to specific stars, references to primordial blueprints stored in a house of writings. This is not how a culture invents gods. This is how a culture remembers engineers. Travel east in your mind to India, and the pattern persists. The Vedic and Puranic texts speak of the Devas, the shining ones, and the rishis, the seers, as though they inhabited a threshold space between the human and the more than human. They are not pure abstraction. They sit in assemblies, debate cosmic law, teach astronomy, mathematics, and ritual to selected human students. The 7 rishis in particular are portrayed as culture bearers, carrying knowledge through cycles of destruction and recreation. They instruct kings, define legal codes, and set the correct proportions for fire altars that encode astronomical cycles in geometry. Again, the language is more technical than mystical. These figures are legislators and scientists described with reverence, then gradually divinized by distance. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan arrive as feathered serpents, but behind the symbolic form is a recurring narrative structure. A pale, bearded figure comes from across the sea, teaches agriculture, astronomy, building, and law, then departs with the promise to return. The Maya credit Itzamna with inventing writing and the calendar, bringing order after chaos. The Aztecs maintain that their most important rituals and structures are copies of what the lords who preceded had already established in an earlier epoch. The gods are remembered as teachers, lawgivers, civilizers. Their worship emerges later, but their first identity is functional. They make civilization possible by restoring what was lost. Even in Greece, beneath the familiar Olympian pantheon, there are older strata of memory. The Titans, the mysterious Pelasgians, and the culture hero Prometheus all hint at a time when knowledge came from those who were not quite human in the ordinary sense. Prometheus steals fire, often interpreted as technology itself, from the gods to give to humanity. The punishment that follows reflects the danger of knowledge out of sequence, of tools used without understanding the responsibilities that come with them. Zeus, in this reading, is not just jealous. He is an administrator enforcing restrictions placed there for a reason. Humanity is not ready. The myth, reinterpreted, reads like a garbled policy document from a previous stewardship. If these gods were in fact a remnant population of survivors from an earlier high civilization, their behavior becomes less mysterious and more disturbingly plausible. Imagine a small group of people carrying advanced knowledge into a world of traumatized survivors, scattered bands living at subsistence level after global catastrophe. They would appear superhuman. Their understanding of the stars, of agriculture, of construction, of medicine would seem magical. They might choose to establish order, to concentrate populations around teaching centers, to rebuild according to the templates they remembered. They would create cities, codify laws, define calendars, and institute rituals that preserved crucial information in story and symbol. But they would face a problem we can barely comprehend. How do you compress the knowledge base of a global civilization into forms that stone and story can carry through millennia of chaos? How do you encode orbital dynamics, geological cycles, and ethical constraints in myths and rituals that illiterate shepherds and farmers can transmit across generations without understanding the underlying? You turn cosmic mechanics into gods. You turn protocols into taboos. You turn technical manuals into sacred texts. You cloak calibration procedures in liturgy. You embed warnings in stories of divine punishment. The gods become the personified interfaces of a damaged but still functioning system of civilizational maintenance. This is where the bureaucratic language of ancient texts becomes crucial. When Sumerian prayers list the Anunnaki in hierarchical order, assigning each a domain and a temple and a specific set of offerings, they are not just flattering imaginary beings. They are preserving an organizational map. When Egyptian hymns enumerate the names of Ra, corresponding to different hours of the night and different sections of the Duat, They are not only composing poetry. They are preserving a timekeeping and navigation system wrapped in religious language. When Vedic chants recite the names and attributes of the Adityas, the solar deities, in connection with particular days and rituals, they are encoding a calendar and its associated cosmic correlations. Read this way: pantheons become manuals. Each god is a module in a lost operating system of civilization. Enlil governs air, atmosphere, and storm, not just as weather, but as the dynamics of the breathable envelope around the planet. Enki presides over fresh water, subterranean aquifers, and the engineering of canals and irrigation. Thoth is responsible for writing, measurement, and the correct keeping of time, especially the intercalation of days to keep calendars aligned with celestial cycles. Varuna oversees cosmic order, the Rita, which looks suspiciously like an attempt to describe physical law as well as moral law. These are domains within a civilizational architecture, functions that must be maintained for a complex society to function. The later religious developments, with their emphasis on faith, devotion, and personal salvation, obscure this earlier technical layer. But hints remain at the edges. The Hebrew Elohim, a grammatically plural term often translated simply as God, originally referred to a council of beings. The divine council scenes in early biblical texts show a presiding figure and attendant, sons of God, debating, planning, and assigning tasks. These scenes look less like a mystical vision and more like a board meeting. The memory of a structured assembly of higher beings deciding the fate of human societies surfaces again, blurred and theologically edited, but unmistakable if you have seen the same scene repeated in Sumer, Egypt, and Ugarit. None of this proves that non-human entities walked the earth, or that extraterrestrials built the pyramids, or that some hidden race ruled from the shadows. That is not the point. The evidence suggests something more subtle and more unsettling, that the earliest civilizations we recognize understood themselves as junior partners in a project that began before them. They did not think they were inventing civilization. They believed they were restoring it under the guidance of those who remembered more. The gods were the memory bearers, the archivists, the living repositories of a world that had ended. When they finally disappeared, whether through death, departure, or assimilation, what remained were the stories, the rituals, and the ruins. By the time later generations tried to make sense of those remnants, the original context had dissolved. The technical meanings of the myths were lost. The calendar became superstition. The protocols became empty ceremony. The gods solidified into idols or abstract theological principles. But beneath the layers of interpretation, the structure persists, like the faint outline of erased blueprints visible under a palimpsest. There was an earlier plan. There were earlier builders. And the beings called gods in the oldest texts may have been simply this: the last visible shadows of that vanished order walking for a time among its inheritors, trying to teach them enough to begin again before disappearing into legend. Monuments are not decoration. They are statements. When a civilization invests generations of labor, vast resources, and the full weight of its engineering capability into a single structure, it is not engaged in vanity. It is encoding something it considers essential, something that must survive when everything else fails. Stone outlasts wood, clay, papyrus, and memory. Stone endures fire, flood, earthquake, and the slow erosion of wind. If you need to send a message across the abyss of time, to speak to descendants separated from you by catastrophe and amnesia, you do not write it on something that burns. You carve it into the bones of the earth itself. The Great Pyramid of Giza is not a tomb. This has always been the uncomfortable truth that Egyptology struggles to reconcile with its placement in the official narrative. No mummy was ever found in the king's chamber. No treasure, no hieroglyphic inscriptions declaring ownership or religious purpose. The only marking is a rough graffiti in a relieving chamber above the main gallery, questioned by some researchers as a later addition. What the pyramid contains instead is precision. Corridors aligned to true north within 3/60ths of a single degree, blocks fitted so tightly that a blade cannot pass between them, chambers positioned with mathematical relationships to the structure's overall geometry, shafts aimed at specific stars as they appeared in the ancient sky. The pyramid's dimensions encode multiple mathematical constants. The ratio of its height to its base perimeter equals pi, the fundamental constant of circular geometry. The structure's slope angle, approximately 51.8 degrees, creates a height-to-base ratio that equals phi, the golden ratio found throughout and optimal design. The perimeter of the base multiplied by 2 equals 1 minute of latitude at the equator. The weight of the pyramid multiplied by 10 to the power of 15 approximates the mass of the Earth. These relationships are not coincidental. They are not the result of aesthetic choices. They are deliberate encoding of planetary data into architectural form. The pyramid's location is equally precise. It sits at 29.9 degrees north latitude, 1/3 of the distance from equator to pole. This placement maximizes its visibility from the surrounding region, while positioning it at a mathematically significant coordinate. More significantly, the pyramid lies almost exactly on the longest land meridian on Earth, the line of longitude that passes over more continental landmass than any other. If you wanted to mark a reference point for a global coordinate system, a prime meridian for a civilization that understood the planet's geography, you would place it where the Great Pyramid stands. The Greenwich meridian that modern civilization uses is arbitrary, chosen for political convenience. The Giza meridian is optimal. Descend now through the narrow passage into the structure's interior. The Grand Gallery, rising at 26 degrees, its corbelled ceiling soaring above, is not a hallway. It is a resonance chamber. Acoustic tests reveal that the King's Chamber resonates at precisely 110 Hz, a frequency that induces altered states of consciousness and matches the resonant frequency of human bone. The chamber's dimensions create standing waves at specific frequencies. The entire structure functions as a three-dimensional instrument designed to generate particular acoustic effects. This is not architecture for the dead. This is architecture for transformation, initiation, or communication using sound as a medium. The three pyramids of Giza align with startling precision to the three stars of Orion's belt, as they appeared in 10,500 before the Common Era, accounting for the precession of the equinoxes. This correlation, known as the Orion correlation theory, places the conceptual design of the Giza complex thousands of years before the Fourth Dynasty, when Egyptologists claim the pyramids were built. Even if the physical construction occurred during Khufu's reign, the astronomical template they followed was ancient, preserved across millennia, and finally implemented when resources and stability permitted. The pyramids are built to a plan that predates them, aligned to a sky that their builders never saw, encoding knowledge of precessional cycles requiring thousands of years of observation to calculate. Consider what this means. Precessional observation requires tracking the position of stars against the background of the zodiac over centuries. The Earth's axis wobbles in a slow circle, completing one full precession approximately every 25,900 years. This causes the position of stars at dawn on the equinox to shift gradually through the zodiacal constellations. To recognize this movement, to calculate its rate, to project it backwards or forwards in time requires sustained astronomical observation across generations and sophisticated mathematical methods. Yet the Giza complex demonstrates knowledge of precession by encoding a star alignment from 7,000 years before its supposed construction date. The Sphinx, weathered by rainfall that ended thousands of years before Egyptian dynastic civilization began, gazes directly east toward the point of sunrise. During the Age of Leo, approximately 10,500 before the Common Era, the Sphinx would have watched the constellation Leo rising on the spring equinox, a lion monument facing its celestial counterpart. This astronomical alignment connects the Sphinx to the same ancient template as the pyramids, suggesting both structures are components of a unified design commemorating or encoding that specific epoch. The Age of Leo, falling within the period of catastrophic climate change at the end of the last ice age, becomes a timestamp carved in stone and celestial mechanics. Move now across the Atlantic to the Americas, where the message repeats. The Nazca lines in Peru, vast geoglyphs carved into the desert floor, are visible primarily from the air. Their purpose remains debated, but their scale and precision demonstrate sophisticated surveying and geometric understanding. Some lines extend for miles in perfectly straight paths across varied terrain. Others form geometric shapes, spirals, triangles, trapezoids. Still others depict animals and plants. What links them is intention. These were not made casually. They were planned, measured, and executed to survive. And they have survived because the Nazca Desert is one of the driest places on Earth, where rainfall is so rare that the shallow trenches remain visible for millennia. The stone complexes of Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, and other Andean sites present their own encoded messages. Blocks weighing hundreds of tons fitted together with precision that modern construction struggles to replicate. No mortar, no gaps, polygonal joints so complex that each stone's shape is unique, yet all interlock perfectly. Conventional archaeology attributes these to Inca construction, yet Inca records state they found these structures already ancient, built by the old ones, before the flood. The lower courses of many sites show weathering and construction techniques distinct from the upper courses, suggesting multiple building phases separated by vast time. The megalithic foundations survive while everything built atop them has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. Pumapunku in Bolivia presents blocks with machine precision cuts, perfectly flat surfaces, precise right angles, standardized H-blocks that appear mass-produced. The andesite from which these blocks are carved is one of the hardest stones, requiring diamond-tipped tools to shape according to modern stonemasons. Yet the blocks at Pumapunku show no tool marks, no evidence of abrasion, only perfectly smooth surfaces and sharp edges. The site is dated to approximately 600 before the Common Era, but some researchers argue the dating applies only to the later clay structures built around the megaliths, not the stones themselves. The megaliths, like those at Giza, may be far older, reused and revered by later cultures who found them already standing. Megalithic structures worldwide share common features, suggesting a unified purpose: astronomical alignment, acoustic properties, massive scale intended to survive catastrophe, and placement at geographically significant locations. Stonehenge aligns to solstices and eclipses with precision, requiring centuries of observation. The passage tomb at Newgrange in Ireland illuminates its inner chamber only during winter solstice sunrise, the light travelling down a precisely aligned corridor to strike the back wall. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to approximately 9600 before the Common Era, features massive T-shaped pillars arranged in circles, carved with animals and abstract symbols, predating agriculture and supposedly predating civilization itself. Yet someone organized the labor to quarry, transport, carve, and erect stones weighing up to 16 tons, then deliberately buried the entire site, preserving it for discovery 11,000 years later. These structures function as time capsules, but not in the way museums preserve artifacts. They are active markers, encoding information in multiple layers. Their alignments provide astronomical data. Their dimensions encode mathematical constants. Their locations mark geographical coordinates. Their acoustic properties suggest ritual or technological functions. Their massive scale ensures survival through events that would destroy lesser constructions. They are built to outlast empires, languages, and memories, to remain visible and intriguing enough that even amnesiac descendant cultures will study them, measure them, and perhaps eventually decode them. The question becomes, what are they warning us about? If these monuments are messages across time, what is the message? The astronomical alignments point to specific epochs, particularly to dates around 10,500 years ago, the end of the Younger Dryas period when global climate shifted dramatically, megafauna went extinct, and human populations experienced massive disruption. The repeated theme across cultures is catastrophe, flood, fire, cosmic impact, the fall of previous civilizations. The monuments mark the locations where knowledge centers existed or were re-established after the catastrophe. They encode the astronomical and mathematical understanding necessary to rebuild. And their scale, their precision, their deliberate indestructibility all speak to a single desperate imperative. Remember, these structures were not built for kings or gods. They were built for us, for future generations who would need to know that catastrophe is cyclical, that it has happened before, that civilization can fall completely, and that recovery is possible if certain knowledge is preserved. The pyramid is not Khufu's vanity. It is a library in stone, encoding planetary data, mathematical constants and astronomical coordinates for a civilization that understood it would not survive intact. The megalithic sites scattered across every continent are not primitive religious centers. They are markers, warnings, blueprints, and promises, built by people who knew the cycle would turn again, that the sky would fall or the waters rise or the earth shake, and that whoever crawled from the ruins would need to know. It happened before, they survived it, and here is where they left the instructions to begin again. History does not progress in a line. It turns in a spiral. Civilizations rise, accumulate knowledge, reach heights of sophistication, and then collapse, scattering their achievements into fragments that later cultures will mistake for beginnings. The archaeological record shows this pattern repeating. Complexity, followed by simplification, followed by slow reconstruction, followed eventually by new complexity. We call this progress, but the ancients called it something else. They called it the cycle, and they warned with every tool at their disposal that the cycle was not finished, that it would come around again, that we are not exempt. The Bronze Age collapse provides a documented example of how quickly complexity can vanish. Around 1200 before the Common Era, the interconnected civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean experienced simultaneous catastrophic decline. The Hittite Empire vanished. Mycenaean Greece fell. Egyptian power contracted. Syrian cities burned. Trade networks spanning thousands of miles disintegrated within decades. The Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders of uncertain origin, ravaged coastlines from Anatolia to Egypt. But beneath the invasions lay a cascade of environmental and social failures. Drought, famine, earthquake, internal rebellion, economic breakdown. Within a century, literacy disappeared from Greece. The palace economies collapsed. Populations scattered to subsistence farming. Knowledge of writing, administration, and advanced technology was lost for 300 years. Imagine being alive during that transition. Your grandparents tell you of vast palaces, fleets of ships bringing tin from distant lands, scribes who recorded everything in symbols you cannot read. But the palaces are now ruins. The ships stopped coming. The scribes are dead, and no one remembers what the symbols meant. You live in a world of fragments surrounded by evidence of a sophistication you cannot replicate. The great works of your ancestors become legends, then myths, then confused stories about giants and heroes who must have been something other than human. Because how else could they have built what you see crumbling around you? This is cultural amnesia in real time. This is how civilizations forget they were ever civilized. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire followed the same pattern. By 500 of the Common Era, the complex administrative machinery that had governed millions across 3 continents had disintegrated. Literacy plummeted. Trade networks broke. Specialized knowledge preserved in libraries burned or was lost when the institutions maintaining them collapsed. The engineering knowledge that built aqueducts, roads, and heating systems vanished. For centuries, European populations lived among Roman ruins they could not understand or reproduce. They quarried ancient buildings for stone, melted down bronze statues for metal, and invented legends about the supernatural powers of Roman builders. The concrete formulation used in the Pantheon's dome would not be rediscovered for over 1,000 years. Each collapse follows a similar cascade. First, environmental stress, climate change, drought, flood, crop failure. Second, economic disruption. Trade breaks down. Specialized production becomes impossible. Complex supply chains fail. Third, political instability. Central authority weakens. Regional powers fragment. Warfare intensifies. Fourth, population collapse. Disease, famine, and violence reduce numbers below the threshold needed to maintain specialization. Fifth, knowledge loss. Without institutions to train specialists and preserve records, technical knowledge vanishes within a generation. Finally, amnesia. Within a few centuries, descendants do not remember that their ancestors possessed capabilities they have lost. The break in continuity is complete. The Mayan collapse around 900 of the Common Era provides another case study. The classic Maya built sophisticated cities, developed complex writing, made precise astronomical calculations, and maintained trade networks across Mesoamerica. Then, within decades, the great cities were abandoned. Construction ceased. The long count calendar stopped being recorded. Populations dispersed into smaller settlements. When Spanish conquistadors arrived 600 years later, they found ruins reclaimed by jungle and populations that had lost the ability to read the inscriptions carved by their ancestors. The Maya themselves had multiple competing explanations for why the cities fell, none fully satisfactory. The memory had degraded into myth. What these documented collapses reveal is the fragility of civilizational memory. Literacy, the technology that should preserve knowledge across generational breaks, requires institutional continuity to function. Writing systems must be taught, practiced, and maintained. When the institutions collapse, literacy can vanish within a single generation. The children of scribes, if not trained, cannot read their parents' texts. Within 2 generations, the script becomes decoration, mysterious symbols whose meaning is lost. This is not theoretical. This happened to Linear B in Greece, to Maya hieroglyphs in Mesoamerica, to cuneiform in Mesopotamia. Each had to be painstakingly redeciphered by later scholars because the living tradition of reading them was broken. Now apply this pattern to the much larger collapse that ancient texts describe. The flood, the catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age, the event that separates the pre-diluvial world from historical civilization. If Bronze Age collapse could erase literacy and advanced technology for 3 centuries, what would a global catastrophe erase? If Roman collapse could reduce Europeans to living in the ruins of their ancestors without understanding them, what would a flood covering the lowlands, a cosmic impact triggering fires and climate chaos, or a rapid sea level rise drowning coastal population centers do to global knowledge? The answer is visible in the archaeological record. It would reset everything. The Younger Dryas period, 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, shows exactly such a reset. Global temperatures dropped dramatically within decades. Glaciers re-advanced. Megafauna went extinct across North America and northern Eurasia. Human populations faced catastrophic environmental stress. The impact hypothesis suggests a cosmic airburst, or impact triggered this climate shift, causing widespread fires and atmospheric disruption. Whether the trigger was cosmic or terrestrial, the result was civilizational collapse on a scale that dwarfs any historical example. Whatever human cultures existed before this event were subjected to environmental pressures that would have destroyed any but the most desperate remnants. The survivors of such catastrophe would face an impossible task, preserving knowledge through conditions that barely allow survival. Most would focus simply on staying alive, finding food, shelter, avoiding predators and hostile groups. Only a few, perhaps those who understood that knowledge itself was the most valuable resource to preserve, would attempt to maintain technical information, astronomical observations, mathematical principles. They would encode this knowledge in the most durable formats available: oral traditions, ritual, monument, and myth. They would teach their children that these things mattered, that they must be preserved, that someday the world would stabilize enough to use them again. This is what Sumerian, Egyptian, and other early civilizations claim they did. They do not say they invented civilization. They say they restored it, that they received knowledge from survivors, that they built according to ancient plans. The Sumerian King List states kingship was lowered again after the flood. Egyptian texts speak of followers of Horus re-establishing order after chaos. Hindu texts describe avatars appearing at the beginning of each age to restore Dharma. These are not creation myths. They are restoration myths. They describe the process of climbing back from collapse, of recovering fragments of lost knowledge, of slowly rebuilding complexity from the scattered pieces that survived. What makes this relevant is not just that it happened before, it is that the conditions for collapse still exist. Our current civilization is more interconnected, more dependent on complex systems, and therefore more vulnerable to cascade failure than any previous human society. We have built a global supply chain so specialized that disruption in one region affects economies worldwide. We have created energy infrastructure so interdependent that failure propagates rapidly. We have produced nuclear weapons capable of creating the very catastrophes ancient texts describe. And we have changed the planetary climate in ways that increase the likelihood of extreme weather, crop failures, and mass displacement. Modern civilization operates on the assumption that progress is permanent, that knowledge once gained cannot be lost, that our technological sophistication makes us immune to the cycles that destroyed previous cultures. But this is not how the world works. Knowledge is not permanently accessible. It is maintained by living people within functioning institutions. When those institutions fail, knowledge fails. The internet seems like a permanent repository of information, but it requires electricity, server maintenance, and device functionality. A serious electromagnetic pulse, whether from solar storm or nuclear weapon, could destroy the electronic infrastructure overnight. Within weeks, most digital information would be inaccessible. Within a generation, it would be forgotten. The ancient warnings encoded in monument and myth are not about primitive superstitions. They are about systemic fragility. The pyramid at Giza encoding pi and phi is not showing off mathematical knowledge. It is preserving it in a format that survives when books burn and hard drives fail. The flood myths appearing in every culture are not religious fiction. They are the traumatic memory of real catastrophe, preserved because the survivors understood that their descendants needed to know it had happened and could happen again. The astronomical alignments at megalithic sites are not primitive religion. They are calibration points, markers saying, here is true north, here is the solstice, here is when the cycle turns. We are not the first civilization to reach global complexity and face existential threats. We are not the first to manipulate genetics, split atoms, or alter planetary systems. If the legends and the evidence are read together rather than kept separate, the implication is that previous iterations of advanced human culture existed, flourished, and fell. Not alien civilizations, human civilizations. Us before. And they tried to warn the future. They tried to preserve enough knowledge that the climb back would be faster, that the depth of the fall would be survivable. They failed to prevent their own collapse, but they succeeded in leaving breadcrumbs for anyone who would listen. The cycle remembers even when we forget. It is written in stone, in sediment layers, in genetic bottlenecks, in the suspicious sophistication of supposedly primitive mathematics, in the global consistency of flood myths, and in the desperate scale of monuments built to survive what their creators knew was coming. The message is not that we are doomed. The message is that collapse is survivable if we prepare, if we preserve, if we remember. The ancients were not fools worshipping imaginary gods. They were survivors of a catastrophe we have forgotten, trying desperately across the chasm of time to tell us, it happened before, it will happen again, and when it does, these things will matter. The mathematics, the astronomy, the locations, the warnings carved in stone. Listen while you still can. Remember while memory is still possible, because the cycle has not ended. It is simply waiting for the wheel to turn again.
If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe, and activate notifications so you don't miss our next videos.